Trees is an atheist channel that has been on YouTube for over 12 years. And during that time, it has racked up nearly 250,000 subscribers. The fact that over that time he has put out only 60 videos shows that he focuses on content and quality over sheer volume, which clearly is not a wasted effort. One glance at his video list may well be enough to get an understanding of his general views. But since he was a Christian before starting this channel, I feel it best to start by looking at how he lost his faith in the first place and deconverted. Incidentally, is a term that isn't recognised by my word processor. Hence, I wonder how recently it's been added to the dictionary, even if it has been. Fortunately, he did a video on this subject that I watched and gained much insight into. And so I drafted this video to see what he was like from a Christian point of view. I don't know his name personally, so for politeness, I'll refer to him as Mr. Tree. If he wishes to make his name known to me, that is entirely his choice, and one I'll respect. But I'm not going to bother changing things around. Before I begin, it is clear that Mr. Tree has already received much criticism from Christians on this self-same video, and so wrote a response in the description. I'll leave a link to the video below to get an idea of his stuff. But he mentions he's been accused of strawmanning Christianity, shifting the goalposts, lying about his experiences, misrepresenting Christians, and many other things besides. I'm glad he did, because the more I have to go on, the more complete my understanding of him should be. I have no reason to disbelieve anything he says. And I've seen some Christians be just as stubborn or biblically reliant. Whilst I haven't seen shouting, hitting, and Lord knows what other abuse from Christians, there's no point denying it, just because you don't see it. Abuse often happens behind closed doors, or in communities where it's not policed as it should be. I'm hoping this doesn't colour my view of Mr. Tree's belief, but it has been a theme that hovers over his account, so I apologise if I seem to focus on that. So with that covered, let's begin. Mr. Tree starts off by saying that atheism happened when he wasn't looking. Theism happened when he wasn't thinking. Well, this can put many people off listening for the first time and end up with noise raging in their ears throughout the first chapter. This is where much of his baseline information comes from, namely his ravenous curiosity, his inquisitive and dissecting mind, his love of logic puzzles, and his destructive, if ethical, disassembly of things. Being exposed to church at a young age was giving him a wealth of new questions to ask and people to ask them to. And many answers were given. However, as his questions grew more inquiring and asking more intrusive questions about God, actions, and reasoning, the answers became less satisfying, dried up, and eventually just became hostile and threatening. This intimidating response to his passionate but still innocent curiosity dampened down his willingness to fight these put-downs. So he had to accept that in terms of religious questions were not acceptable. He trust and obey the sermon. This attitude became so ingrained, it became almost a groan when he heard similar questions from young children. And so it seems so silly how petty he seemed. The blunt response to questions is something I find in all walks of life, and religion is no exception. One thing that stands out on his account, however, is the level of aggression given by the adults he asked, from low, threatening reprisals when asking practical questions linked to the water cycle, which I don't find unusual for a 6-year-old to know about, since my brother worked it out at age 2, to having his head slammed into a wall for innocently wondering if Jesus may have had a stammer. This goes beyond simple religious zealotry and stands firmly in the realm of extreme bigotry, abuse, and violence. No wonder Mr. Tree found it hard to maintain his quest for knowledge outside the standards of the religious dogma. I'm impressed Mr. Tree stuck with his independent studies by entering the school Christian group, as I wouldn't have continued in such a realm if I was in that situation. It sounds as though the group was more of an echo chamber than a discussion group, however, with the assert, confirm, and add rules that seem to be at play. Though I'm sure it was a bit more masked than originally portrayed. This is a shame, as it sounds like it could have been a good place to build up faith, and he certainly expresses his fulfillment in his faith, even considering taking the cloth. And clearly seemed to have a great deal of connections, not only with his peers, but with visiting preachers, one of whom said he foresaw he would do great things for Christianity. All sounding good so far. But, like a lot of things, you never know how strong it is until it takes its hit. One of his teachers made a good point on an essay about his religion. I think it went something like this. You've explained what you believe, but can you explain why you believe it? The why. My father always tells me to express the why when it comes to anything, such as a job interview, in your arguments and your reasoning. Why? Mr. Tree, to his credit, at any point in his life in this culture, took the question seriously and had a good, long, hard look at his reasons. And that's why he found it hard to justify. The coincidences and sensations he can't explain could be put down to ignorance. The life's lessons were just him learning by experience, nothing new there. When putting it to the youth group, they put their own divine command down to life interpretations, similar to his own life lessons. Much the same was said by people at church, one even mentioning that prayers heal the sick. When challenged with the understandable question, what if they die despite the prayers? The response was, it was just their time. This made the crack in Mr. Tree's faith, already opened by his teacher's shrewd question, wider and deeper. With his critical thinking invading on his religious thinking, something he had been forced to separate at a young age, it could only get bigger. This is where some people might expect me to start picking apart Mr. Tree's arguments, and I will, but not right now. I'll put that towards the end of the video, since I'm trying to see things from the turmoil he clearly went through in his deliberations, which is more important to understanding him than just stamping out his reasons. If I do that, then what am I learning about him? Nothing really. those of you that want to go straight to the arguments, that's fine. I'll leave a link in the description. I'll leave a timestamp in the description. Also, I'll be doing many timestamps. If so, I'll be bringing up this so I can remember doing the editing. But Mr. Tree delved into the dogma in order to find justifications for his faith. The number of believers, including genii and the longevity of faith, fell under other analogies such as flat earth or geocentrism. Beliefs that people changed thanks to experiencing God under pastoral care merely meant inspiration to live a better life, which is more than likely. Whilst never raised again in class, his attempt to prevent a repeat performance led Mr. Tree to look further, taking a good long look at the Bible, finding contradictions, intense cruelties, and injustices in the pages of Scripture. All of these made him think he could do a better job than Yahweh. A bold statement, one I'll come to later on. Whilst initially rejecting this notion, it continued to bother him. He finally decided to delve into the main reason that many people seem to believe, that many Christians justify believing: hell. Essentially the classic Pascal's wager. However, after considering its implications for belief over humanitarianism and its strict binary system, lacking the genius one would expect of a god as great as Yahweh, hell seemed less like a big threat and more like a small idea with a big shadow. His last attempt was by putting his faith in God's hands and openly asking for a direct response. Not cryptic, but plain and straight, with no room for confusion, to prove himself once and for all. He had no reply. He heard nothing. Depending on the church environment and the belief system practiced by the family, childhood faith of any magnitude can become incredibly brittle. As with most things brittle, it can stand up to a great deal of force in some areas, being whacked around left, right, and centre, being blazed in a fire. But when one hits it in just the right place, it can crack. And when a crack forms, it can start to break down. That doesn't mean that faith is weak. No, you can have faith as strong as the foundations of the earth. But even the land can be torn apart by forces exerted in the right earth. This process is what caused Mr. Tree's faith to crack, fall apart. Now he saw faith as a system to protect lives. Faith in humans is earned on evidence, and any contradiction to the evidence would be examined. Not permitted by any means, but certainly looked at critically. Faith in God, in his eyes, was demanded, had no evidence to back it up, and relied on one's conviction rather than any evidence. If anything contradicted, it was instantly dismissed as wrong or blasphemous. Only a perverse being would use a similarly perverse system as faith. His disorientation after emerging from his introspections, shows how deeply ingrained the dogma had been for him. Being alone in a crowd where he felt like a new being until he found companionship in his brother who had found his own way, which in my mind shows that clearly atheists can come out of all manner of places, not just one tunnel. Still, they went through the motions, out of habit, presumably, all whilst still experiencing the confusion of having a totally different outlook on the world, trying to rationalise it with comparisons to the Tooth Fairy or Father Christmas as a test of reasoning and understanding. But with the abuse and the aggression, it must be the big one. Their announcement of faith didn't go the way they hoped. If anything, it ramped up the abuse. Their attempts to reason were shouted down, and eventually it was dropped for the most part, and appeasement failed to yield fruit on either side. It's not hard to see this very hardcore, dogmatic religious cult as the main contributor to the lack of reconciliation with changing views, making an incredibly brittle faith. You either totally resist everything or you crack. With their stagnant beliefs making fluid discussion and open minded reasoning incompatible, and only causing mud to stir up and darken the mood, I cannot blame Mr. Tree for his position on religion. He tried to reason with the understanding of God, but the moment he touched subjects that had never been considered, or things that could destabilize his faith, he was blocked. And this reduced the flexibility of his faith, making it more likely to crack and shatter. Moreover, when he did try to expand his understanding beyond the confines of the murkiness, clarity wasn't there. I wish to make it clear that Mr. Tree is better than those he came from, has good reasoning not to return to the faith. Due to a negative reception his simple inquiring mind received at a very early age, and the abuse he and his brother were given when they tried to help others out of the deep quagmire they'd been stuck in for many years. So clearly, he's got a head on his shoulders, and a good one. But this is the part of the video you'll be expecting. Does his biblical explanations hold any merit? Are they indeed the undoing of someone's faith? Does his positions on prayer put its efficacy in doubt? Could he do a better job? Quite as much as he would make us think. I'll skim through the ones he presented, and I feel obliged to warn you, one of them gives me pause about his own morality. Many of these can be put down to a lack of openness to alternative positions, but when you're in echo chambers, it's hardly surprising. You're hardly ever going to get new ideas coming to formulate, and it's completely understandable that these things can happen. I myself have done extensive studies into surrounding topics of sin, God's will, and his power, and other things of that ilk, to understand what they are at the smallest levels, so I may use that baseline understanding to look at the bigger issues. It was a long slog and I didn't have any outside help. But I'm open to different ideas within reason and make strides to see things from other people's views. Often, I've already done videos on that, so I'll be raising this again to show, well, I can do things in the editing suite. But until then, let's crack on and delve in. Those of you that aren't particularly interested in this can stop the video now. It's all going to be arguments about it, so up to you. But back on. The first question. One of his first early questions was Adam and Eve getting punished for eating the forbidden fruit? This one can be approached from two angles. Firstly, God told them not to eat it. Therefore, they were punished for disobeying. Second, which is what my studies suggest, they pass the blame to the next person. Adam blamed Eve for giving him the fruit. Eve blamed the serpent for tempting them. They never repented of their sin. They put blame on someone else. That isn't a good thing to have going throughout the generations. So punishing them is actually a good idea in this case. Second, God walking in the garden. Yes, God is everywhere, but let's put it this way. How would you describe the feeling of someone being near or becoming aware of you? Someone once said they knew I was the spy in a game because he heard my eyes open. That makes less sense than this does, and he was playing within the rules, I know that. Third, why punish mankind? The answer, God knows best, is close to the truth here, but we are to take, but if we are to take that to be literal, then mankind as a whole hasn't learned anything from this. And if we don't have these things holding us back as a species, namely the pain of birth, or well, the pain of pregnancy, the pain of birth, and mankind struggling to provide, we would overrun this planet and cause more damage than we already do. I cover most of this in one of my videos, so check the link above or in the description for that particular video. 4. Why cry for Lazarus or raise him from the dead? True biblical scholars will tell us that we only get the judgment of heaven and hell at the end of days, rather than upon death or completing funeral rites. So Lazarus wouldn't have been in heaven at the time Jesus called him. Plus, even if we think of death as just a lengthy absence without contact, we still find it hard to say goodbye to those we love for that amount of time. As anyone in a long distance relationship can testify, no matter where they go or how happy they are in that place, if we can't speak to those we love, it hurts. 5. The biblical flood. The flood is a contentious story in every possible way. I'll leave a link in the cards to my video on the topic, so the bulk of it can be explained. But to clarify a few things related to this, it does not break the water cycle, since it wasn't just rain that caused the flood, but the land releasing its water as well, the fountains of the earth. And several pluvial events have occurred in geological history, so the rainfall isn't too confusing either. Noah built the ark as a sign of faith to protect his family. If no one else believed, they wouldn't be getting on the ark. God, he could have held back the rain, in theory, could have held back the waters around his family and all the animals. But the likelihood of someone who didn't believe, who was evil, sinful, all the things that Noah and his family weren't, is remarkably high. Therefore, it's much better than having a shelter that can float on the water than simply surround them or a wall or something. Plus, a barrier that high is quite difficult to maintain. If you think about it in terms of magic, it's going to be a pretty big wall. God may have the power, but if it goes higher than the mountains, essentially they would have become the first submariners, which isn't a pleasant idea. Bear in mind, we're taking this all literally, which is something I'm not sure the biblical flood was meant to be taken as. His references to prayers and predeterminism not mixing is true. This is the classic case of assuming there's only one future, if God can see everything. I've done a whole video on that, well, several videos actually, so I'll definitely leave a link below for those videos. But just to give you a rough idea, if you factor in free will or even the potential for a different outcome, you've instantly opened a whole new vista of potential futures. And if God knows everything, then God knows every single one of them. And everyone in them. That makes omniscience far bigger. And we should not be belittling it to just God knowing one thing and them having only one plan. He may have one plan, but he also knows what happens in the other futures, and so therefore we should trust him. The classic arguments of for believing, namely numbers, the genii that believe, and the longevity. Truth doesn't mean much, but wisdom of the crowd can be applied to this. Since the likelihood of one person knowing everything is ridiculously low, and a large enough crowd with different points of view, and you get a broad picture of the truth. Mankind has believed in many gods, and this is linked to my video on, well, my video series of the history of ideas, so go check that one out as well.
This next section was recorded earlier in the video, but due to the fact I said I wouldn't be delving into the arguments at that stage, I had to shuffle it around. So this is on geocentrism and flat Earth, and how it wasn't actually considered correct by everyone at that time.
Though I think that was something different, since the Greeks knew full well that the stars didn't move perfectly in perfect circles in the night sky, and flat Earth was probably dealt with long before any of us really thought about it. Because, well, many people say Columbus was the first person to think the world was round. But no, he just thought the world wasn't quite as big as it was. That's why he thought sail east and get to India. Hence why America is often called the West Indies, certainly in the old days. That's by the by. The contradictions in the Bible Mr. Tree mentions are actually easy to rebuff, because it's often a matter of just looking at the context of those passages that he mentions and understanding what it means. Yes, 1 Corinthians 11:14 does say long hair is a disgrace for men, which means I'm in a bit of trouble, but I think that's more to do with lice and getting caught on things, doing work that men tend to do. But it's important to bear in mind numbers, whilst it does say growing hair, well, commanding men to grow their hair long, that is directed to the Nazarites at their time of separation, which does forbid the cutting of hair outside of certain circumstances. A simple glance at the start of the chapter is enough to understand that. Want to read the whole chapter? By all means, and you'll see so much more. 1 John chapter 4:18 says, "No fear in love." And Deuteronomy does involve God saying, "Fear me" a lot, essentially. I covered this in a previous video, which I will link below. I need to remember to lift that one up. Where I say that love and fear are essentially the same, because how many people have been nervous at going on a first date? The excitement, the fears, and how many people have been terrified at their wedding day? The nerves, the jitters, you get the idea. It'll be in the description below. Psalms 51 verse 16 mentions God doesn't like burnt offerings, whilst Genesis 8:20 to 21 indicates he does. This is because the meaning behind the offering is more important than the offering itself. God doesn't want us to just burn things for the heck of it, or sacrifice things for the heck of it. No. This is very much a matter of why we are sacrificing, why we are doing it. We're consecrating areas. We are giving our praise, giving our worship. Just to demonstrate this, in Genesis 4, I normally don't like referencing these things because, well, what's the point? They're not going to believe by the Bible. I might have referenced another. But in Genesis 4, both Cain and Abel made offerings to God, only for Cain's offering to be less pleasing. Nothing explained about the offering itself or how it was offered, save their composition, and even that is vague. Again, I've done a video on that, so check it below. This generally means one should be of a different mindset to Cain on giving the offering, rather than giving a different sort of offering. Hence showing it's not the offering that matters, it's the mindset, which is sort of why we don't tend to do much in the way of offerings these days. Certainly not in the same as they did in Old Testament times. But punishing the younger generations for a parent's crime, the examples given just show the confusion, but they have some notable differences. When it says punish for father's crimes, God says he will do it. And when he says don't punish them for it, God is telling us not to do it. It's plain and simple. God will do the punishing. It's not our job. Yes, someone may be the son of someone who did a terrible thing, did a terrible sin. But we aren't to punish them. That is God's job. He said as much, let him do it. To link back to Cain and Abel, Cain was marked so he wouldn't be killed by the people who saw him. He would face the punishment and not be released by death. Essentially, God is saying, I will do the punishing, you guys just get on and live. What about the cruelties of God? Can those be explained away? Let's look at the ones presented. Bear in mind, I go into some detail here. Genesis 38, 7 to 10. Onan and Er's wife is one that I've covered in a video about the sons of Jacob. Follow that link in the description below. To sum it up, it's justified due to the high risk of STD transmission. Yes, that has never been stated openly in the Bible, but it's linked to so many other cases of sexually immoral behaviour, which in modern times would be seen as a prime STD transmission potential. As it was now, so would be then. It makes sense. It's worthwhile noting that Onan did lie with Er's wife, had his fun, but he spilled his seed on the ground rather than impregnate her. His reasons I sort of agree with, since I told a previous girlfriend, I wouldn't raise another man's child, but I would raise him as my own. And Onan was told that the child wouldn't necessarily be his, it would be raised as his brother's. But does that excuse his actions? No, since STDs can still be passed through intercourse without ejaculation. He clearly had his fun, he clearly slept with her, but he did not impregnate her, didn't complete in her. Hence, he put everything at risk with no reward potential at all. That is just foolish beyond belief. That, in my opinion, is worse than any attempt at homosexuality at all. It's essentially the same. No wonder God killed him. 2 Kings chapter 2, verses 23-24. Elisha was mocked by some children for being bald. Since he'd been a stranger in Bethel and the boys clearly left the town to mock him for his baldness, it's clear these boys, likely teenagers, weren't pleasant people and had little respect for boundaries or people. This is bullying, plain and simple, and I do not respect anyone who condones it. The fact Elisha responded and cursed them shows that he was hurt by it, and therefore they should quite simply stop and go away. Due to the bluntness of the text, which focuses on the deeds of God and the peoples, it does not give any indication that the boys understood what it meant. And they could have quite easily taken it further, making it more painful, more personal, as many bullies tend to do, which would have made them blind to the two female bears coming up and mauling them. The fact that the bears tore apart 42 of them implies two things. Firstly, the boys were in large numbers. This wasn't a gang of children. This was a mob openly mocking people. And the fact that so many of them so many of them got killed shows they were so focused, so sluggish, about causing emotional pain, they didn't notice until so many of them were killed. Since many references say mold or something like that, the general phrase implies being torn apart. And while Syrian brown bears are fairly hefty, it takes a while for them to tear apart people. It's not like a pack of bears, it's not a whole crowd of bears. No, it's two bears. It'll take maybe a second or two to tear through one, so staying there for nearly a minute whilst being torn apart by the bears. Anyone would have been sensible. It's not like, what on earth are these things? They knew the bears were there. They knew bears would have been nearby. They lived near a wood, for heaven's sake. If a gang of bullies insulted me, mocking me with all manner of things, even me yelling Warrington, say they'll rue the day they hurt me, and they don't care that includes you'll walk into that road and get hit by that bus, only for that to happen. I wouldn't mourn. Elisha, since not much emotion is said in various parts of the Bible, only focus on how God affects them or how they're affected by other things, not so much by the killing, as very few tales at that time would have done. That's not something they would have focused on. Elijah may have been affected by it, but ultimately, he cursed them. The bears made their approach. The deed was done. Judges 19 to 21, the war on the Benjamites, is, according to Mr. Tree, the biggest injustice in the Bible. Which, with the way he presents it, can make it seem so. Except the part where he mentions the rape of a woman. Rape isn't a small thing, and so don't make it seem so. Just don't. I've never been raped. One of my dearest friends was raped. He got to the point where our head teacher would tell social services to F off. So just don't. It's also worthwhile that the situation is similar to Sodom, where it was clear they would have taken their sports with whomever they wished, as the men were saying, "Bring out the man, so we may do our sport with him." They took the concubine, who, by all accounts, is generally someone that faces that sort of behaviour on a daily basis, and raped and abused her until she was barely able to get home before dying. That's not right. That's not just having their sport. That's brutal. The tribes took it upon themselves to strike back and wipe that brutal, barbarian rape culture out of their lands. This is something that is illegal, not just today, but also by the laws of Israel. But they had no king to enforce the laws then, so the tribes had to do it. It's also worthwhile noting that God didn't incite the war. He didn't say, rise up and strike against them. No. He merely acted as an advisor, saying who should lead the first attack, if they should advance or hold back. Yes, they mostly advanced forwards. Most said, go up against them. But that's a bit like saying, blaming the manager for saying, go up and just muller that team. Attack that flank. You mate, you go up first. You can really muller them. Are they to blame for winning? They're merely the strategist. They're merely the one pointing out. They're not the one wielding the sword. The game was decided. The match was set. And the fact that it lasted less than a week shows it wasn't a drawn-out war. It was a quick and brutal, several quick, brutal battles. And it clearly mentions that the Benjamites fought with valor. The fact they knew the tribe was going to die out, especially since they had sworn never to give their children in marriage to the Benjamites, and so brought in another tribe. Yes, by brutal measures, but that was a tribe that wasn't part of Israel. So they had to bring them in somehow. This shows they are aware of the consequences of their actions. They wiped out the culture, they made sure it wouldn't come back. A brutal culture, one that none of us would accept these days. But they're aware that the people would die. So they made sure they had the chance. So does Yahweh have the high ground in using their methods of communicating? Or does he degrade himself? I don't think it's a matter of moral sovereignty or pandering to the people when it comes to communication. It's a bit like us Brits or Americans who seem very particular about it, using to speak a foreign language when we go to that country. We're in their territory. We're speaking directly to them. Do we degrade ourselves by learning that language? Absolutely not. To suggest any sort of lowering, we have to move into communicating with animals. Monty Roberts uses a technique for communicating and bonding with horses that mimics mares disciplining young foals, essentially pushing them out of the herd and then inviting them back in. It seems confusing. Any horse person thinks their horse will just completely ignore them, but in fact, it works. When sled dog drivers have to get their dogs to behave, they had to step in with a whip and show them who's top dog. I saw this on a documentary where some people were racing to the North Pole, one on a car, the others on sled, and it was noted that these aren't domestic pets, these are pack animals, these are work animals. It's no excuse for animal cruelty, and it was clear that woman didn't want to do it, but sometimes you just have to show them who's boss, assert who's the pack leader. No excuse for animal cruelty by any stretch. But when you're working with animals like that, you have to be strong. You have to step in, show them who's boss in the way they understand. Perhaps this is why Mr. Tree got no reply when asking God to make himself known unambiguously. How can God speak to him in a way he would accept if he doesn't allow God the space to speak to him in a way he can understand? That is worthwhile considering. I mentioned hardening hearts in last week's short video, which I'll link below. I will say that if God wishes to harden and soften hearts at will, that he's surely taking away free will, which is worse than allowing one's children to make their own mistakes. I mean, I don't know if I'm making mistakes at the moment, but my father is clearly letting me do so. I've gone through several terrible bands, and he's like, well, no responsibility. I'm learning from my mistakes. That's all we have to do. If anything, sheltering someone from the world in that way makes it harder for them to adjust to life. So can Mr. Tree do a better job? As he is? I don't think so. If he's willing to say that bullies clearly being terrible thugs, being mauled by bears is a terrible thing, or that rape culture should be allowed to continue, I'm not sure. But also, if God knows all, and that, as I've said time and again, is far more than we can wrap our heads around, then I don't think we're in any position to question God. Because, well, he can see a lot more than we will ever understand. Faith in God is different from trusting humans. But here's a position we might want to take. Think of God as another human whom we haven't met yet. We haven't met personally. This position, therefore, only applies to the ones who don't know him. For example, talking about a big boss. The boss man, as an old friend of mine called God, is only a good way of thinking about it. Us, the lowly worker, the lowly customer, trust him. He demands trust. He demands it. We don't know. We don't see him personally. But here's the thing. We have to trust. We just need to trust the person we're interacting with. That's the customer service or the delivery man. He know the big boss? No, but he knows his line manager, who talks to his manager, talks to his manager, and so on and so on until we get to the person that's right next to the big man. That is the thing. It's a chain of trust. One person trusting another, and the trust goes two ways. That isn't being foolish. That is business and connections. Yes, if something breaks on the line, someone should deal with it. Nothing wrong with that. That's something we do in business all the time. To trust someone's doing it. The trust Mr. Tree is talking about is clearly on the highest level, though, of life and death. The small bits of trust that can be gained by trial and error is sort of how the evidence that we need for our trust is procured. How can we find evidence that someone is trustworthy to look after our lives? How? Until we decide to trust them to prove it to us. We have to give them the chance to prove it. If we don't give God the chance to prove it, how can we trust Him? How do we know? Ultimately, being raised in an abusive cult that doesn't encourage critical thinking or flexible decision clearly put him on a back foot. He was not in a great position to return to faith, and certainly, whilst he originally assumes that a little bit of delving causes an argument to fall apart, it's when you actually consider the broader scope and start looking at other things first and building up to it. That is when we get our understanding. The fact that we have a stalwart atheist who, for the most part, seems focused on abuse exposure just proves that the more insulated a culture is, the less adaptable a person is to change. And certainly how hard their perceptions can be to change. Once they're set in a well-heeled state, it's impossible to make them out again. I was hoping to take some more from Mr. Tree's channel and use that to work out his position. And whilst I gained a broader glance at some of those videos just by looking them once over, particularly one where he mentions narcissism and references his own mother, the long trawl through his deconversion video, I think, has given me a broad enough perspective on him to leave it here and look at the rest of his videos at a later time. In summary, he's a man with a scarred past and a broken faith, one crudely and bluntly constrained, giving him a brittle structure that didn't shatter in an instant, but crack under a well-placed question. His quote from Oppenheimer is a good one to sum up the experience with faith. We know that the only way to avoid error is to detect it. And the only way to detect it is to be free to inquire. I hope, Mr. Tree, that you get to see this. I hope I don't appear like any of your original detractors. I'll delve into more of your videos at some point. Know you are respected. Your views aren't wildly off, just due to the fact you were raised in an area which didn't encourage critical thinking, and so when something seemed wrong, you didn't inquire further, didn't push with an argument, didn't push with an answer. I think that meant you were less liable to look at alternatives. It sounds to me like a Bible-heavy cult, though I get no indication of whether it was a fundamentalist cult or not. Just because the cult doesn't mean it's fundamentalist by any means. So, what I'm going to say is, take my words in mind and consider a discussion at some point. May the Lord God bless you and keep you. And everyone else who might be watching, even at this late hour. Thank you so much. And be with you.